Introduce myself. My name is Dustin Rose. I'd like to consider myself an expert aquarist. I've worked on several aquariums in the past several years, not only my own, but helping several other people set these aquariums up. I'd like to take this time to show you guys how to properly set up a saltwater aquarium so that you are not only wasting money, but you're not killing fish in the meantime. And know that you can have a beautiful aquarium in your home. Real quick, will everybody introduce themselves to each other and tell us a little bit about your interest in aquariums? We'll start over here.
My name's Rachel, and I don't know anything about saltwater aquariums.
My name is Tammy, and I have had a saltwater aquarium before, and they're gorgeous and beautiful. And they can also be high maintenance depending on what you have.
Okay.
My name's Kevin. I also have shared in saltwater aquariums, a couple of them, and performed the maintenance.
My name's Chad. I think they look nice, but they're expensive.
My name's Ted. I've never had one, probably never will.
My name's Allison. I think they're pretty, but I'm a little bit worried about the maintenance.
I'm Michael, and we used to have a freshwater aquarium, which we enjoyed, but we've never had a saltwater one, but they are beautiful. In fact, my son-in-law had one of the most beautiful ones I ever saw.
My name is Tom, and I've never been around.
My name is Janet, and I think they're beautiful. The maintenance scares me. If I could afford to have one maintained, I would definitely have one.
Chelsea, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
I'm Chelsea, and I have seen tanks and enjoy going to the fish stores and looking at the things, but don't know much about the difference between salt water and fresh water, so I'm curious to learn about what it means to have a saltwater tank.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to pass out a few handouts, if you could pass those around. Those are just some main points to remember, and a picture of one of the most beautiful tanks in North Texas. Real quick, I'd like to ask you guys a question. Do you guys have pets?
Yes. Yes.
You have pets? Okay. Would you ever put your pet in a cage that was too small for it?
No.
Or put it in an environment where he just had lots of excrement and urine everywhere that they had to live in?
No.
Would you underfeed your pet? Okay. Well, I think that's actually normal, but it's actually what a lot of people are doing to fish because of the lack of education for what's needed for the fish. A lot of people don't realize the equipment that's needed, and what they are actually doing is putting the tropical fish in tanks that are too small for them, in which they end up swimming in their own filth and thus dying. And so that's why we're here today, to avoid that and teach you some of the basic elements to start an aquarium properly so that your fish can thrive. What do you guys think about this puppy right here? He's pretty cute, huh?
He's pretty awesome.
If you came across this dog in the wild, you might want to take him home with you, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Except for maybe you.
Oh, no.
Well, let's say you just really wanted to take this dog home because he's so cute, but he took a special food that you couldn't afford to feed him. But where he lived, he had plenty of that food. Would you leave him behind or take him with you? What would you do? Leave him behind so that he could thrive and live. Well, today, people are taking fish out of their environment that they can thrive in. Plenty of food, plenty of balanced bacteria, the perfect salt balance and temperature for them to live, thrive, breed, and multiply. And they're bringing them home where they can't provide that same environment. And slowly, some faster than others, are killing these fish. Real quick, I want to show you an example of this tank. Believe it or not, this is a common sight. This tank here is going to be the majority of what you see in people's homes. When you look at an aquarium at the zoo, people typically get inspired by those because they're beautiful and they're well kept, and that's because trained experts have set them up properly. And you can do that in your home too. You've just got to take a few steps and keep a few things in mind. Real quick, this tank has a whole bunch of nuisance algae. You can't even see the live rock that's in this tank. Do you guys see any rock in there? No, it looks like bushes, but I guarantee you there's rock underneath this nuisance algae. You don't see any fish. The odds are that this tank had fish at some point, but because the elements were off so bad and it was so poorly maintained, possibly even set up poorly from the beginning, that there are no fish in it any longer. You've only got mushroom corals and no other corals living. Most likely there were other corals in this tank, but the only thing to survive is mushroom coral, which it's the weed of the ocean. So of course it's going to be the most hardy. Right now, as we speak, there are people killing fish, much like this one, because they don't know how to properly set an aquarium. Today we're going to learn how to avoid that. Real quick, I'd like to show you guys what a good, healthy aquarium looks like. While this aquarium didn't get this way overnight, it did start off on the right foot. If you don't start out right, you're never going to be able to achieve a good aquarium like this one. Real quick, this is a torch coral, which is a very difficult coral to keep alive. You've got green star polyps, pagoda cup, green bubble, more torch coral here. Some people call this a hammer. You've got SPS coral and sponge. Sponge, believe it or not, is one of the most difficult marine lives to keep alive. That being because if any oxygen gets caught in the coral, it's going to die. So it has to be transported completely underwater. Additionally, the only way a sponge feeds itself is by the water flowing through its tubules and it trapping nutrients. And that's why the flow in the tank is important. You saw it swaying back and forth. That was the flow that provided the environment needed. And so you've got to take all these elements into account in order to set up and maintain a successful tank. Real quick, a couple pieces of equipment that you're going to need. These are the basic pieces of equipment. There's much more out there that you can buy as you get more advanced, but these are the mandatory. You've got your tank, refugium, live rock, live sand, your system pump, and lighting. Your tank can be any size, any shape, almost made out of any type of material for the cabinet and the hood. You've got several different materials for the glass. You've got polycarbonate, which is a type of plastic that tends to be cheaper to use on larger tanks, but it does scratch easier than glass. You've got glass, you've got different types of glass. You've got what they call fire glass that is a little more clear than your typical glass. It doesn't affect the colors as much as your cheaper glass does. This is a 200-gallon tank here. They start out at about $1,000 and go up from there. If you're going to buy a used tank, that's more than okay. Just make sure you get a tank that's been properly maintained and taken care of throughout its entire life. If you get a tank that's been sitting out in a hot garage or an area that's not climate controlled, it can actually affect the seals, which could end up in causing a leak. Have any of you seen a gallon of water or a gallon of milk been dropped on the floor?
Unfortunately.
You've seen the mess that it makes. Imagine 200 gallons. You're pretty much going to have to call a disaster recovery service to help you clean it up. It's not a pretty sight. The next component is going to be your refugium. Your refugium is a very important piece because it's basically your biofilter. You've got your water coming in these black tubes going through this physical media, which is a sock. It filters the water through the sock. Once the water filters through the sock, it goes through this chamber, which usually has some sort of beneficial macroalgae. That is a biological filter. So as excrement and food moves through there, it's going to filter out biologically. That algae is going to eat the big three, the nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, which we'll talk about a little more here in a minute. Over here, the final chamber is going to be your pump. Typically, that's where you place your final chamber because it's got to pass through the other chambers before it gets to the final chamber. And then from there, it's pumped back up into the tank, in which it's just a cycle. It goes into the tank, back out, and this is where most of your filtration goes on. Your next component is going to be your live rock. It can be anywhere from $18 to $15 a pound. We'll discuss this in further detail later on. The next components can be live sand. It can be as much as $1 a pound. You can find it cheaper, but $1 a pound is a good area to start. Here's a couple other pieces of equipment that are not necessarily mandatory, but in my book they are. I feel that you need these in order to have a successful tank. Like you saw in the video earlier, there was motion, flow in the tank. There was no stagnant water. How I was able to achieve that was through wave makers. These are small submersible water pumps that blow water at an interval that you program over the tank. And that allows for an erratic movement similar to the ocean. That helps the nutrients move around the tank. It just helps maintain a healthy tank. This is a protein skimmer in which basically it filters out all the bad stuff from the water. You've got your test kit, which is going to help you test your big three. I've got a test kit here. I'm going to go ahead and pass this around so you can take a look at it. We'll talk about the big three here in a second. I also have a couple other things I'm going to pass around here in a moment. This is a refractometer. It's used to measure your salt level in the water. We'll talk about that in further detail. We'll go ahead and pass that around though. And what we have here is a super buffer. This is a material that allows you to adjust when your water levels get out of balance. You dose your tank with chemicals like this. Water quality. The most important thing in a tank, of course, is going to be your water quality. You've got the big three you have to worry about, and that's your nitrites, your nitrates, and your ammonia. All of these in the tank should remain at a 0. You're going to test for them weekly. If any of them spike, you're going to use a chemical similar to the one that's being passed around now to compensate for that. A lot of people will not test their water. They'll just go on aimlessly, not knowing what the condition of their water is. Nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia are clear. There's no visible change. You literally have to test for it every time to know about it. I recommend that you test your tank daily until your tank is well established. After a year, you can cut to once a week if everything has balanced out okay. The next thing we need to discuss is the bacteria in your tank. This is what I would consider as the second most important element. This is actually what's going to aid you the most in maintaining that proper water quality. Aerobic and anaerobic bacteria exist in your saltwater tank. They hitchhike in on rock, live rock, sand, and fish. And that's actually why live sand and live rock are called live. You could just go get a rock from anywhere and stick it in your tank, but it has no bacteria on it. And so it has no beneficial value to your tank. The bacteria is used and exists because it actually consumes your nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia. So as the bioload increases in your tank, this bacteria takes care of it for you. So essentially, eventually you want your tank to be self-maintaining, where you don't have to add any of those chemicals that I was passing around. You want it to be an entire ecosystem, that when your fish use the restroom, the bacteria take care of it. It keeps it a clean environment. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship, but it's one that people often overlook because you can't see the bacteria. So the next element is going to be the live rock. Your live rock is your home for your bacteria. Bacteria, you can only have as much bacteria in your tank reliably as there is surface area for it to thrive on. Live rock typically comes from the ocean, although there are synthetic live rocks that exist. And they are very holey and porous, similar to a sponge. So there are millions of inches, or thousands of inches of surface area of each rock, in and out of the rock for the bacteria to live on. If you had just a regular stone, like something out of a Colorado river, it has very few inches of surface area. And that's why, if you look at this rock, it looks very mangled and has lots of holes and very porous. What's recommended is 2 to 4 pounds of live rock for every gallon of water. At $8 to $12 a pound, you can see how 2 to 4 pounds of live rock per gallon can get expensive very quickly. And that is why this is one of the most skimped on parts of the aquarium. Nobody wants to buy rock. Okay? You can see it, but it's still not a very sexy product to purchase. But you need to know it's the most important part. Because if you're going to have the right amount of bacteria, you've got to have a space for it to live and thrive on. Same thing for your live sand. A lot of people, this is kind of a debate in the Aquarius world of whether you need a deep sand bed or not. I definitely recommend a deep sand bed, and that's because it also is an area for the bacteria to reproduce and live in. There's lots of surface area in the sand, and it helps with, the more bacteria you have, the more you can eliminate the big three: nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. I recommend 4 to 6 inches across the entire bottom of the tank. Now, the reason a lot of people don't recommend sand is because they think it's ugly. They think that the sand gets kicked up and it lands on the coral, and just the tank is foggy with the sand. But most of the time, the problem with that is that the Aquarius doesn't take the time to properly tune the flow in their tank. So if you add a wave pump in your tank, just make sure it's not pointed down in your sand, and you'll be fine. The next thing we're going to talk about is cure time. When people set up a tank, they spend thousands of dollars. They get very excited about their new fish that they're going to put in, and they go to the store and they buy as many fish as they can, as their budget allows, and they dump them in the tank all at once. Can anyone tell me why they think that might be a problem?
Maybe the fish don't get along.
Fish don't get along, okay. Anyone else have an idea?
Too many fish.
Too many fish, okay. Anyone else?
Have diseases.
They could have diseases, but that's not actually the problem. The problem is there's not a large enough bio load, or not enough bacteria base to handle the bio load. So when you first set up your tank, the rock comes in. It's coming from an ocean. It's being shipped in. On its way in, it's having some die-off. So let's say there was 100% of bacteria on there. On the shipment over here, probably 50 to 75% of it's going to die. What the cure time does, it is allow the tank to set up and properly repopulate that bacteria. The dead bacteria that comes off the rock is going to turn into nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. Primarily ammonia, which will kill a fish quickly, within several hours. And so the 25% of bacteria that's left over consumes the dead bacteria, repopulates, and then starts to lower the big three back down. What you need to do is allow 2 to 4 weeks after you set up your tank to return back to zero. Test your tank every week to make sure that it's going down. And then as it starts to get real low, you can go ahead and test every day. And as soon as your tank reaches zero, you can add your first fish. Not too many, and we're gonna go into that in further detail here in just a second. The next important detail is salt levels. Basically, for fish tanks, you're going to need to maintain a 0.2 salinity level, in which you're going to use that refractometer, which I passed around, to drop some water on it, hold it up to a light, which it's going to refract the salt water and show a reading of how much salt is in your tank. Fish can survive a variation in salt. They're used to swimming in and out of different areas that have different salt concentrations. On the other hand, coral and vertebrates like snails either don't move or they move very slowly, and so they're not used to sudden swings in salinity levels, and so they're more sensitive. For those, you're going to need to maintain a 0.24, and it's going to need to stay about as close to 0.24 as possible. For a coral or a reef tank that has coral and fish, I recommend getting a top off, auto top off. What that does is it automatically, as water evaporates, puts fresh water back into the tank so that it maintains its salt level. Can anyone tell me why they think that the salt level would change in the tank?
Water evaporation.
That's right. The water evaporates and the salt remains, therefore increasing the concentration of salt to water. And the only way you can set that back to balance is adding salt-free fresh water. In a fish-only tank, there can be large swings, like I said, but a coral tank I really recommend, although not mandatory, an auto top-off. The final thing that is overlooked often that is very important when setting up an aquarium is temperature. This actually is something that I would say 90% of aquarists do not pay close enough attention to, and they can't figure out why their fish are getting sick. Most often, if they're doing everything else right, it's this. A fish-only tank can maintain a temperature of 75 to 82 degrees. A coral tank needs to stay between 78 and 82. Reason for that is tropical fish go a little deeper in the ocean than corals do. Corals live closer to the shore so that they can get the light needed to process their food. The fact that they're closer to the shore makes them also more shallow, and the shallow areas tend to be warmer. They're more affected by the heat of the sun. And so reef tanks need to maintain a little bit higher temperature than the fish. We need to make sure that the temperature in a tank swings no more than 2 degrees within an hour. The reason for that is an extreme temperature swing can stress the fish and the coral, which is not immediately visible. And so that's why a lot of people do not know what's going on. Your tank may have swung temperature throughout the day, and it's a week from now that things are showing stress. Well, that stress started when the temperature swing was. People who need to be concerned about that are people who have tanks in open areas that are drafty, people who have spouses that like to change the temperature on the thermostat to extreme heat or extreme cold, or if you have your tank next to a window. Believe it or not, the sun coming through that window can heat up your tank very quickly. In order to compensate for that, if you do have one of those conditions, is a chiller and a heater. The chiller can consume very easily 2,000 watts of power. It's a large box, can be about that large, and it sits on the outside of the aquarium. It's basically an air conditioner for the tank. And it can be set to come on at half-degree intervals so that your tank never swings more than 1 degree in either direction. For the winter, when the tank's getting cold, we have a heater. Heaters can consume anywhere from 100 watts up to over 2,000 watts in power, and they're contained in either a titanium or glass structure. There's a heating element in there that comes on, once again, at a half-degree variance that you set. Can anyone tell me why they think the material used would be titanium or glass? Anyone want to take a guess?
So it doesn't rust in the salt.
Corrosion. Yeah, you want to avoid corrosion. Any type of metals in an aquarium tank is bad news. It can cause your fish to slowly be susceptible to parasites and things like that. Well, you're now equipped to start up a saltwater tank properly. You've just got to keep the main points in mind. You need to purchase your equipment, purchase it all up front. Don't buy the equipment and piece it together. If you can't afford to do the tank right away, save up and wait till you can do it right. Determine how much live rock you need and buy that much live rock. Do not skimp on live rock. You will pay if you do not. Determine how much sand you need. Once again, that's up to you. I recommend a deep sand bed. Most importantly, let your tank cure. You want to keep those big 3 levels at a 0. Check and maintain your proper temps and enjoy. One last point, I want to come back to why you don't add multiple fish at once. The biggest reason is that every fish you add is a bio load. And so if your bacteria is in a tank after it's cured and it has no fish in it, then it only has enough bacteria that's supported by what little die-off's in there. If you add a fish, all of a sudden you don't have enough bacteria to handle that bio load. So it takes a little time for that bacteria population to grow and meet the level needed to assist that fish. If you add 4 or 5 or 10 fish at one time, that can make it to where the growth of bacteria never exceeds the bio load that is put in the tank, and eventually you have fish die off because the tank becomes poisonous. So the best rule of thumb is after you let your tank cure, 1 fish a week. Test. If your big 3 are at 0, you can add 1 more fish the next week. If they're not at big 3, wait. The big 3 are not at 0. Wait till they are, and then you can add an additional fish. At this time, I'd like to take any questions you guys might have.
What do you feed them?
What do you feed them? There are a plethora of different foods available. There are dry foods. There are frozen foods that you thaw out. Mice and shrimp. It depends on the fish that you get. But whenever you go to the fish store, you're going to want to consult with the aquarist there about what type of food you're going to feed your fish, because it can depend. For example, tangs require to eat algae. You'll see them going around your tank eating algae off the rocks because that's what they eat. They don't eat meaty food. Whereas a fish like a trigger likes shrimp or squid. Or sharks love mussels. So it just depends on what type of fish you're going to put in your tank. Any other questions?
Sounds like a lot of electricity to run one of these properly with a chiller and a heater and pump systems.
It is a lot of electricity.
That's a lot of money.
Oh,
It-
I didn't think that it really did cost, does it cost quite a bit to do that?
It costs a lot of money. This is a rich man's hobby, put it frankly. People on a budget can participate, but they got to do it smartly. They've got to plan, and they've got to hunt good deals. But yeah, that's part of the reason that people don't buy enough live rock. They don't buy the equipment they need. It's expensive. So you have to know going in, you're going to need to put in the effort. You're going to have the patience needed to do it correctly and the budget.
Or you just keep buying more fish.
That's what we're trying to avoid. We're done killing fish. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to the presentation, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And good luck with your aquarium